Good evening, everyone. I'm Gretchen Crosby Sims. I'm the Executive Director here at the Institute of Politics. We are very pleased to welcome this expert panel to discuss the war in Yemen. A special thank you to our partners for making this event possible, both the Pulitzer Center and the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts. UChicago is proud to be a key partner in the center's campus consortium network of more than 30 universities and colleges around the country. I want to mention a few upcoming events. This Wednesday, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, William Burns, will be discussing his new book on American diplomacy. On Thursday, the Washington Post's Jason Rezaian will be in conversation with David Axelrod about his 544 days imprisoned in Iran. Next Tuesday, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano will be discussing her new book on national security policy since 9/11. You can find out more about these and our other upcoming events at our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We will, as usual, have opportunity for audience questions after the moderated conversation. We'll have a microphone just over in this direction. As usual, we give priority for the first 3 questions to students. We remind you that a question ends in a question mark. And one more note about Q&A. We have noticed that many questions come from young men. We love that, that's great, but we want to make sure that our question and answer period is really inclusive, so we invite everybody to come up. Want to remind you that restrooms are downstairs if you need them. And here to formally introduce our panel is John Mak. John is a master's student in international development and policy. He is an inaugural Obama Foundation scholar from Hong Kong. He is a frequent attendee of IOP events, fellows, seminars, and civic engagement activities, and a terrific contributor as well. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Since 2015, the civil war between the Yemeni government and the Houthi rebel movement is estimated by some to have caused more than 60,000 deaths. Last year, the United Nations warned that as many as 14 million Yemeni citizens could face starvation, making it one of the worst famines in 100 years. Now, earlier in March, the Senate passed a bipartisan resolution that called for an end to US support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. The resolution was later vetoed by President Trump. Today, major uncertainties regarding the situation remain. How did the war get to this point? And what will happen next? Joining our conversation today are 2 distinguished journalists, Maggie Michel and Jeffrey E. Stern. Maggie Michel works for the Associated Press and is currently based in Cairo. She has over 15 years of experience covering conflicts across the Middle East. Her series, Yemen's Dirty War, explores multiple dimensions, including Western involvement in the conflict and war atrocities such as theft of food aid and deployment of child soldiers. And on that note, I'm delighted to share that she and 2 other colleagues were awarded this year's Pulitzer Prize in international reporting for her work on Yemen. Our second guest, Jeffrey Stern, is a writer and development worker. Mr. Stern has written extensively on Yemen, Afghanistan, and elsewhere on The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, Slate, and other publications. His piece last December, From Arizona to Yemen, The Journey of an American Bomb, was published in the New York Times Magazine and traces how a US-made bomb made its way into the Saudi arsenal and was eventually dropped in northern Yemen. Earlier this month, his story won Amnesty International's USA Media Award in the International News category. This conversation will be moderated by Dr. Paul Poast, Associate Professor and the Director of Graduate Studies at the Department of Political Science here at the University of Chicago. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guests.
Well, thank you for the introductions, and thank you, all of you, for being here this evening to hear about what is a really important event, and perhaps an event that many of you would like to know more about, because it's in many ways maybe an event we don't have as much awareness of as we should. To emphasize the should part, the BBC recently said that the Yemen is experiencing the world's worst man-made humanitarian disaster. And part of that is due to the statistics you just heard. Estimated that since 2016, there's been close to 60 to 70,000 civilian deaths, let alone, and that's just civilian deaths. That doesn't speak to the wider humanitarian crisis in terms of famine and disease that has been breaking out in Yemen. And so it truly is a humanitarian crisis, but it's one that what I hope is by the end of this evening we'll have a better understanding of. And to start off, what I want to ask both of our esteemed guests to help us is to just help us to understand, before we go into the specifics of your reporting, just help us to understand, what is this war? How did it start? Based on your experiences, how do you understand why there is currently a war in Yemen?
To start off, I think, like one of my colleagues rightly phrased it, it started as a war, as a fight between two presidents. One is the current president, Hadi, who's now in exile in Saudi Arabia. And the second was the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. I think the starting point in the eyes of many Yemenis is the time when masses of Yemenis rallied in the streets across the country demanding Saleh to step down. He ruled for 30 years. It was part of the Arab Spring uprisings that sweeping the entire region. The day Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak stepped down, February 11, 2011, it's almost the same time Yemenis rose up against Saleh. So it took a year for him to actually step down. Saudis, Americans, UN provided him with a safe exit, and that was in return for leaving power. He's not going to be prosecuted. He's going to stay in the country, and the ruling party will have a share of power. That type of transition appeared later to be disastrous because he did not leave power. He just gave some power to his vice president, who's now the president. And over the years, it was a revenge to come back. And the allies, to help him settle scores with those who opposed him and forced him out of power, his allies were his old enemies. And those are the Houthis, militiamen from the north part of Yemen. They fought Saleh for 6 years, and they had their own agenda. They allied with Saleh, and they took over most of the country, forcing the president, Hadi, to flee and seek Saudi support. So we're talking about years before 2015 that has been building up. But because the Saudi intervention is such a disaster, and because the air campaign left massive civilian death in the country, and it's hardly now people remember what happened before the Saudis started the war. I mean, they created so many tragedies, and the media can just report what they have been seeing as the worst. But there was a background, and the background is it's merely Yemeni political struggle, power struggle. Now, the Americans just because Saudis are their top ally in the Middle East, they just help the Saudis in whatever decision or whatever move they're taking. They provided weapons, air-to-air refueling for their jets. They had military advisors, American military advisors, sitting in Riyadh advising the coalition in the air campaign. So I will leave the second part to Jeff.
That was very thorough. I guess the only thing I'd not add, but kind of highlight is to the extent that in the media we've focused on Yemen, it's probably disproportionately been about the Saudi air campaign, which is really what I was covering. And the way I would most simply describe that is the Saudi government and its Gulf allies responding to a legitimate but grossly exaggerated threat from Yemen, the threat of kind of an Iranian rearguard in Yemen. And the reason I say legitimate is because the Houthis have made incursions into Saudi Arabia. They've been fairly rare and small, but they've happened. And of course, the Houthis have managed to launch a few ballistic missiles into Saudi Arabia that I think all but one have been shot down by Patriot missiles. But I think that the Saudi approach is that essentially everybody in this country is either hostile to us or is providing succor to those who are hostile to us, at least in the north. So again, I think like the most simple way I would describe it is one government that's trying to suppress a threat that it's exaggerated, not made up, but is exaggerated.
This is great. So I think this is really helpful to kind of start off with this overview of exactly this war that is both a combination of a civil war, an international war because of the interventions, because of the sport, which makes it a very complex war. Even for someone who's, studies these type of wars, it's immensely complex. And what I want to do now is ask some questions about your respective reporting on this war, to kind of get down into the level of understanding really the human element of it and the human tragedy. And then at that point, I want to then pull it back up to 30,000 feet, if you will, to start thinking about kind of the broader geopolitical significance of it. And so to start, Maggie, your reporting, as was just mentioned, your team won a Pulitzer Prize for the reporting that you've done really on the human rights violations that have been committed by various parties, in particular by the Yemen government with support of Saudi Arabia and Gulf allies. And so would you be able to share a little bit about the reporting that you've done, kind of the things that you've seen that went into your reporting, and also about the impact that it's had? Because your reporting hasn't just been reporting, it's actually led to some policy changes by both the UN and some of the other countries involved.
Our team is mainly Arabic-speaking team of 2 Egyptians and 1 Yemeni. Nariman al-Mufti, she's a photographer, and Maad al-Zikri is the videographer. He's a Yemeni guy. And we were trying to strike a balance. We were seeing there are so many abuse happening in the country. There is a breakdown of law and order. There is actions for impunity by all parties. No one is held accountable, and the prisons are full of detainees on every side. So in the past 2 years, we worked on documenting how the Emiratis, which is part of the coalition, has set up a network of secret prisons in the southern part of the country. The south is under the control of the government that's allied with the coalition after they kicked out the Houthis. And instead of restoring the government, and instead of trying to create a model of successful liberal areas in the south, the coalition instead created regional militias and regional armies controlling different cities. And in every single place, there are dozens of prisons. These prisons could be shipping containers, could be schools, hospitals, anything. And they just arrest and detain dozens and hundreds of people. In the south, we found American involvement in this network of prisons. And the idea here is the Emiratis are helping the Americans in the war against terrorism, so these raids are for terror suspects. There is a lot of torture, abuse, sexual abuse. What we did last year was mainly focusing about sexual abuse, because in a conservative society like Yemen, this is a big deal. You're breaking men, you're forcing them into anything to just stop it. So part of the idea was to recruit them. So the Emiratis wanted to turn these suspects into informants, into agents. And we had interviews with officials who at one point were working with the Emiratis, and they gave us full accounts of what's happening in these prisons and how the detainees are being filmed and then threatened and then forcing them to work with the Emiratis. That was part of it when we wrote about it, and we had drawings smuggled from inside one of these prisons that shows how the torture is taking place. One of the results were like dozens of detainees were released, and they were actually searching for the guy who they made these drawings. On the other side of the conflict, you have the Houthis, and they control most of North Yemen in the north, where most of the population lives. There are also prisons, and these are full of thousands of detainees. Anyone suspected of being allied, of having family member, or like traveled even to a government-controlled area, the opposite side, is an immediate suspect and is under threat of arrest. So we interviewed them, interviewed many of these detainees, documented these, like they had in the bodies signs of torture. They had freedom to speak because they are in safe areas, so they fled, and that was better for us to document, to show their faces on camera. After we did that story, we had the Houthis surprisingly saying we're going to investigate these allegations. Our concern was always a backlash, going after our own reporter, but it didn't happen until now. So the reaction and the impact we're seeing is that they at least started to think about it and to say at least that we're investigating, though I'm not sure they're actually taking any action. But that's about the rights abuse. And then about the UN, we think that a big problem happening now is the humanitarian aid that's going to Yemen, that's worth billions of dollars, are not actually reaching the people, because not only the Saudis are closing borders and ports, but even if you manage to bring the aid inside the country, you cannot distribute it, you cannot reach the people, because the Houthis are putting heavy pressure on UN agencies on the ground, and they're preventing them from reaching the people. So that's a story that we did on the corruption and aid. When we released it, second day, the WFP, the World Food Program, issued a really strong statement about Houthis stealing the food from the mouths of the hungry. They're very strong. It was very strong because UN is under threat of losing access. This is the card the Houthis are using all the time, is that if you speak up, you're not going to get in. It's simple as that. It's just about access. If you prevent access, if you deprive UN from getting inside the country, they cannot work. So they have to make some concessions. And when the WFP spoke, that was almost the first time to have any kind of a strong statement by UN. This is mainly what we saw as a direct impact from our reporting.
Well, I mean, that is really amazing. And we'll come back later, I know with both of you, to kind of ask like exactly how you go about and how you handle kind of engaging that type of research for your reporting. But to move over to Jeff, I know some of the reporting that you've done, and especially for me personally as someone who studies what I call like the economics of war, is your article that was in the New York Times Magazine, and the Arizona part of this title, right? And so I think the audience would really benefit, for those who haven't read the story, to just say a little bit about...
Take a moment so they can read it now.
Yeah, take a moment to read it now. That would be useful, and then we'll come back, and then you can share. But can you speak about this? And speak about basically the role of and your experience interacting with individuals in the U.S. defense industry and how they've seen this conflict play out.
And one of the things that continues to strike me again and again is that there is a really convincing argument for why we should be providing providing weapons to the Saudis specifically, but also in general just be selling guided bombs like the one that was used, that's been used in a lot of the airstrikes, maybe all of the airstrikes in Yemen, but was used in the one that I focused on. And that argument is that we should provide precision-guided bombs, because if we don't use precision-guided bombs, they'll use unguided bombs, and more civilians will die. And it kind of follows. It makes sense. It turns out to not be true, but it's a kind of a defense that everybody provides. It's accessible for everyone, and you hear it in Congress. People who are defending these arms sales say that, and perhaps believe it. And people at Raytheon in Tucson, Arizona, who are making the guidance kits that go on these bombs, take a lot of pride in that. And actually, Raytheon calls itself, without apparently irony, a safety company. And they are actually a leader in workplace safety. And they're worried about things like carpal tunnel syndrome and repetitive motion injuries and stuff. And a lot of the employees seem to really take pride in that, I think appropriately so. But also, given that they're making, in a lot of cases, like a lot of the bombs that are being used in Yemen are actually, they're what we call dumb bombs. They're gravity bombs, but they're retrofitted with a guidance kit. And so when you're at, for example, Raytheon, what you're not making the part that explodes, you're making the part that steers it. And so you're able to tell yourself you're making the part that steers it away from civilians, and so it only hits bad guys and never hits good guys. And you hear a version of that line being told. Line workers at Raytheon, people in Congress, even pilots, even Saudi pilots speaking to Saudi press saying, we care about civilians, that's why we use precision-guided munitions. And of course that's, a bomb is only as precise as the intelligence that it's based on, and there's some indication that and I don't have any proof of this, I can't defend it, but there's some indication and just kind of evidence that the Saudis might be deliberately targeting critical infrastructure as a way to sort of create a humanitarian crisis. And so, A, if you have bad intelligence, then a precision-guided bomb just helps you hit civilians more effectively. Mm-hmm. And B, if you're trying to hit critical infrastructure, bridges and dams and factories and water wells, then guided bombs help you hit those more effectively too.
And just to go on the other angle to this, and you already touched on it about hitting critical infrastructure, but another part of your reporting that really stood out to me was when you talked about how kind of the other end of the economic effect, that due to the targeting of infrastructure, it can actually lead to dire economic consequences within the communities that, of course, being hit. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I focused just on one strike, on the movement of one bomb, and then the one strike, the civilians that were killed, and they had been building a well for themselves because a lot of the country is close to famine conditions. So they were building a well, and on literally the last day of digging, right after they struck water, they were bombed. The coalition later said that they thought that the water digger, was called a TEL, a transporter erector launcher. Basically, they thought it was a ballistic missile launcher. And that may or may not be the case, but they hit it, and then a few hours later, after people had gathered to look for loved ones and to help, they dropped 10 or 15 more bombs. So this well was obviously taken offline, and the cholera outbreak began about a month later, kind of near there, and grew to over 1 million suspected cases of cholera. But even beyond the direct humanitarian costs, the lesson that people began to internalize, just this is somewhat anecdotally, people that I spoke to, was that basically we're not allowed to engage in enterprise. If we try to build a well for ourselves, this is what will happen. If we work at a factory, then it might get bombed. We shouldn't even drive too closely to a truck that is carrying what could be valuable cargo. And so that was part of the reason, as it was explained to me, that's part of the reason why commerce kind of slowed down. In addition to the currency problems, in addition to the fact that the country is under blockade, is that some of the commerce that was available to people, a lot of people were kind of afraid to participate in it.
Again, both of you, your reporting, I think, just really does a tremendous job of highlighting the human element and the human tragedy of this conflict. And as I said before, what I want to do now is kind of start pulling it back a little bit, pulling it up to taking into consideration some of the broader implications of this conflict. And for me, during the opening, when you were discussing, Maggie, the causes of this, you brought up the Arab Spring. And of course, this is not the only conflict that's really been kind of in many ways a byproduct of the Arab Spring, you know, the Syrian conflict being another prominent example of this. And for me, as a scholar of international relations, and especially one who has spent time studying Eastern Europe, I find the contrast very interesting. You know, we are now this year is the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Eastern Europe, the rise of democracy, that was the most recent, prior to the Arab Spring, democratic spread. And on the one hand, that led to the establishment of some stable democracies in Europe, in Eastern Europe, such as the Baltic states. It's also led to some democracies that have been experiencing backsliding, such as Hungary and Poland. But it also led to the wars in Yugoslavia, which in many ways are very analogous to what we're seeing in Yemen and in Syria. And so one way to kind of help pull this back and to give it even broader context is, do you have any views on why it is that this particular spread of democracy has really, the end product of it has really been just these tragedies, these wars, these conflicts, that there hasn't been the same type of follow-up like there was in Eastern Europe of an establishment of any type of democracy, which was, of course, the hope of the Arab Spring? And does your reporting on Yemen maybe give you some insights into why that might be the case?
Well, in my opinion, I'm Egyptian, so I come from a country that had one of those Arab Springs that turned into something else. It's not a spring at all. And I think it's about the day after. This wave of Arab Springs, I mean, of these mass uprisings, was somehow spontaneous and didn't have a plan of what happened next when the dictator falls and there's a huge power vacuum. And the only two powers that are ready to take over are either the military or the Islamists. This happened in Egypt and Libya to some extent. When you see now Sudan and Algeria, the second chapter of the spring, you see them learning from this lesson of not leaving the streets and keep on pushing until you have some arrangement for a roadmap that guarantees at the very end that you have fair game. So what happened in Egypt, but I want to say it's different. I mean, Egypt is different from Libya, but what's common here is that you had rulers who ruled for 40, 30 years, and all of these. So they killed politics. They had no political life. In Egypt, there wasn't any opposition, real opposition. In Libya, of course, it was one-man rule. In Yemen, they had a little bit of few political parties, but it's a tribal society, and Saleh ruled by controlling the tribes, by bribing them, by giving them a share of power, and also controlling the military. And that's very important because this is the military that took over the country later and turned against the transition. So I think the answer is there was no clear idea what happened next after you get rid of this dictator. I mean, and now their hopes, they're learning the lessons. Yeah.
So very much a learning mechanism. I think that's a very useful way of thinking about what happened.
Yeah, if you see Sudan now, people are looking. I was just telling Jeff that they're saying we don't want to be like Egypt. That's part of the slogan. It's like Egypt now is is really a bad example, and they don't want to see military back to power.
And Jeff, how would you? What would be your take on this? Similar? Do you see some differences?
I mean, obviously, I'm not from Egypt. I'm from Philadelphia, which people do say the same thing, though. People say we don't want to be like that. I don't know. My response would be actually kind of, I have a question too, which is how much international attention, how much international like pressure was there then 30 years ago versus now? Because this is not Arab Spring, but I look at Afghanistan, and one of the things that to me is similar between Afghanistan and Yemen is that there's not just two poles that are pulling it in two different directions. There's the Iran-Saudi dynamic. There's a bunch of Western countries who are involved in some level or others. All the other Gulf countries, and I don't know exactly what the effect of that is or would be, but were I a researcher, that might be something that I would want to understand better. Is my understanding is 30, 40, 50 years ago it was kind of there were two poles, and there wasn't you were with one of them or you with the other. There wasn't kind of a third or fourth. So I wonder whether that makes things a little bit more protracted.
Yeah, and I think that that's also a good question to have and a good way to think about it, that in comparing it to Eastern Europe, once you had one of those poles withdraw, there's only the one. There's only the U.S. They come in, they promote, and hence you have democracy. Versus, as you're saying, in all of these cases, and Yemen being a great example of it, you have so many actors who are involved, some of whom have a vested interest in preventing an uprising or an emergence of democracy within these countries.
But I also think it becomes really difficult to have a civil society when the person who belongs to a different, and maybe you could argue we're seeing a little bit of this now here, but the person who belongs to a different party is not just someone with different political beliefs, but maybe is being funded by, country XYZ, or maybe is receiving help from intelligence agency, from, I think it becomes, I realize as that comes out of my mouth, that sounds.
Well, and I think that's a talk for another IOP event.
Okay,
at some point
yeah.
here. So,
Yeah.
but this is very useful. And again, I really wanted to make sure to ask that question to kind of help to contextualize the Yemen conflict, so it's not viewed as just a conflict, but that it's really seen in the broader context, both currently and then also historically. Now, the last thing I want to ask you before we turn it over to audience Q&A is, both of you, your reporting is in many ways, I guess a word to use is moving. It's very moving reporting. And because of that, it makes one ask, how did you do it? Both in terms of logistically, how do you go about conducting this kind of reporting you've done? Because these are very difficult situations to be able to work in. And so, that would be kind of a question I know, and I'm sure people in the audience would like to know, is how do you actually go about doing your reporting in these kind of difficult situations?
I think what happens to us is that every single time we go back, it's harder than the previous time because we publish the story, we get reaction, we have more restrictions on our movement and access. Already the country has only 2 functioning airports, only 2. And Sana'a Airport, the international one, the bigger one, is shut down since 2016, which makes life really hard for everyone living in north of Yemen. It's a tough journey to go to the south or to the east. But it involves a lot of planning, a lot of thinking about where to go, whom we're going to upset, who's going to be the person and the party that is going to maybe react in a negative way, what kind of threat is going to happen to our local reporters. In our last story we did, our last visit in August, we actually pulled out our videographer, Matt. He came out and stayed in Egypt for 8 months. Because it was a lot. That was our last trip, and we wrote about different sides, and everybody's angry. So we felt it's safer for him to get out. I think one of the hardest part in Yemen is traveling. You have to drive like 10, 14 hours between different cities because of the so many checkpoints you go through. We also don't actually explain in detail what we're doing. We, as women, cover our faces like we just wear niqab, and that makes life a bit easier for us. We move as a family, and we just don't talk a lot about what we're doing. We keep a very low profile. We stay in hotels where we have some connection to the manager of this hotel. I mean, as much as possible, we just try to be invisible and to go to our sources, to the people we want to talk to in their own house, stay there. They're very generous people, very simple people, despite all their hard lives. They invite you over dinner, lunch, everything. So, I mean, it was hard, but we enjoyed every time, and we're going to go back. And maybe that's why I don't want to explain a little more, so we can go back.
I don't want you to give away your trade craft at all. Jeff, do you have, help us to understand a little bit about how you go about actually engaging in your reporting there?
So I had never been there before. This was my first trip, and I didn't know anybody from Yemen, and I realized I didn't even know anyone who'd ever been to Yemen. So my first step was I actually called someone at the World Health Organization who had been a spokesman years before on a different story I'd worked at, and I said something along the lines of, I doubt you're covering Yemen. I don't even know if you still work at the WHO. I don't even know if you're still alive. So who's going to respond to this email? But would you happen to know anyone who's working on Yemen? And this person connected me to another person who said, there was this photojournalist who just came in from the South. You might talk to her, and she ended up connecting me with a fixer in the South and in the North. And I worked with them for months and months and months preparing this trip. And everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. And everything that could have gone wrong sort of strengthened my resolve that this is, I need to do this in kind of an irrational way, including, publisher pulling out. And for a while, I had letters to the different embassies and to the Houthis asking for permission, but I didn't actually have anyone to publish the story and didn't actually have any money to go. But I think it always is a little bit of a leap of faith, and there's a sense of, when you remove for a minute the reason that you're there and the thing that you're trying to expose, there is a sense of kind of wonder of being in a new place and meeting new people and forming kind of special relationships, which I think is one of the things that kind of carries me through and makes it always a little bit fun and absurd. I mean, because the airport near where a lot of us are covering things is closed, we have to fly into the south of the country and get from, territory that's being in the kind of possession of one belligerent group into territory that's under the other. And so what I was told to do was to dress like a Yemeni and chew gat, which I'd never done before, and get in a car full of, my fixer's brothers, basically. These people I'd never met. None of them spoke English, and I don't speak Arabic. And drive across, I said, well, what happens if, it was the last minute, the fixer said, I'm not coming with you. And I said, what? And he said, just act like you're deaf. And there's probably 40 checkpoints from Aden to the north. And so I would just and the guy next to me kept saying more, more, more. So I kept putting this leaf in my cheek, but I was afraid to chew it because the few times I'd done chewing tobacco a million years ago, I just puked immediately. So I was worried about doing that in the war zone on the way up to. And when we got stopped at checkpoints, people would say, "Who was this?" And I would kind of try to smile and just drool green juice out of my mouth. It was but the whole time I'm thinking this is absurd, but also, at some point I'm going to be on a podium at the University of Chicago telling the story, and I'll get some mileage out of it. So it's that kind of thing that I just think that, this is sort of why we do it. This is it's crazy and it's fun and it's sad a lot of the time, but it's an adventure.
Yeah, and for both of you, I mean, the end result is, has been recognized and awarded, and both of you have, of course, received many accolades for it. And yes, you're both on a stage here at the University of Chicago to share these experiences with us. So at this point, we're now going to turn over to the audience Q&A, and we do like to prioritize student questions first. And I believe the way it'll work is people will go up to the mic. There is a mic back here. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and make your way back there. We can start a line back there with people who have those questions. And we'll just remind you that please make sure that your question ends as a question.
Hi, thank you for being with us today. My name is Nelly, and I'm from Lebanon. And I work in the world of forced migration. So I've worked in several humanitarian crises with Iraqi refugees, with Syrian refugees, and also from people from Somalia, from Eritrea, and a few people from Yemen. And I just wanted to give you the small introduction before I ask my question.
No, it's fine.
I understand that you being with us today is talking more about your reporting experience, but I wanted to ask, how can we address the severity of this humanitarian crisis, particularly with relation to access of clean water and food security? I understand that there are bigger issues that you addressed, such as sexual violence and torture in prison. But when basic needs are not provided, and you have countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and the US backing this kind of war, I don't know how Yemen is expected to move forward when their basic needs, with tribal strife, blockade, and the cruel tragedy of this conflict continues to take place every day, particularly that there is no international pressure or regional pressure whatsoever to address this conflict. Thank you.
Great. So would either one of you wish to kind of address, like, you know, kind of, and it really, in many ways, her question echoes one that I was going to ask, which is kind of like, the country has a failure to be able to provide for basic needs, you know, let alone, you know, thinking about, obviously, like you're reporting dealing with torture and so forth, but we're dealing with, you know, also the cholera outbreak and so forth. And what is needed to be able to address those things, especially when it seems like the international community is not necessarily taking the steps, putting the pressure on to try to fix these things. What do you think can be done to try to address that?
I think UN needs to has a chance to start adjusting its programs in a way that's not emergency, where you deliver food basket for a family, for like it's gonna feed the family for maybe a week, but something called recovery and early recovery and rebuilding and rebuilding the country. So this is the thing when I talk to aid workers, this is what's in their mind. They say that the model the UN is doing now in Yemen is not actually working. They need to move on from emergency into more about investing more in infrastructure, into creating jobs, into building what has been destroyed. As we mentioned earlier that in another talk that there are pockets of fighting. There aren't fighting everywhere. This is not the case. I mean, there are a number of front lines, but the entire country is not in a war, and it's not in a state of war. Then why not UN starting a different model of intervention in Yemen? And as you said, there is no international desire, there is no regional power, there is no one. I mean, Yemenis are left alone in all of this. And maybe UN and the international agencies and aid agencies are the only one who can actually help create a different style of intervention in helping people secure their income or secure. In very limited places in Yemen, we saw these programs for generating income. I mean, jobs, they call it food for work. And that's working. I mean, and people want more of this. They want to have a life. They want to have their own. They don't want to wait for a food basket because it's not working. I mean, this is just, it's a waste, and it's already they get looted at the end. So that's my idea. I mean, they have to move on to early recovery, to rebuilding.
Jeff, did you have any insights on this?
Well, so just from my kind of parochial little basket of airstrikes, to me, it's actually pretty simple. I mean, the question of whether we should be providing bombs to the coalition is not a very difficult question. I think it's pretty much a no-brainer that we need to stop doing that. And that's not going to magically make everything better, and it's not going to cure cholera, and it's not going to get food to people, but it's going to stop making things worse. Mm-hmm. And there are reasons that seem logical for why we should continue arming them, but I feel pretty confident that they're basically all wrong. And this is one of the rare times I've ever felt this. I mean, I always have a lot of ambivalence coming back from war zones about what to do, and if we do this, then that'll happen. And this is one of the rare times it seems very clear to me that this one thing is making it much worse, and all the reasons that we should continue to do it are bad reasons.
Well, very good, very good. Next question. We have another question coming from the audience, so they're coming around here. And again, if you wish, if you have a question, you can feel free to go and you can wait in the back to be able to do the question, to be able to ask your question. So feel free to do that.
Hi, very informative event. I very much appreciate it. My name is Xander Fisher at the college. I just wanted to ask to what extent can you conceive of the Yemeni Civil War as like a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, especially in light of like recent intervention by Saudi Arabia in the conflict?
Okay.
Thank you.
So views on proxy war.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that's accurate. I would say it is a proxy war. Now, at least, it's become that. I would say since the airstrikes began, and I think it was March of 2015, it is at least a proxy war between Saudi and Yemen. I don't know exactly. We were talking about this earlier. It's unclear how much Iranian influence and how much Iranian arms are in Yemen. The Houthis would have you believe none. The Saudis would have you believe that it's all of it.
Yeah.
I get the truth, I guess, probably lies somewhere in between. But I also think it's probably become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy on behalf of the Saudis, that the fear of Iranian influence in Yemen is probably allowed for Iranian influence. I don't know if that's how you would feel.
Yeah, I think there are also different forms of support. It doesn't have to be only weapons. And this has been the thing that's been documented is the Iranians are providing fuel every month to the Houthis, worth millions of dollars, and they can sell it and finance the war. But I mean, it doesn't seem to be a large, support. Until now, I mean, there wasn't a journalist who could prove what type of support the Houthis are getting from the Iranians. It's a big question that no one was able to find an answer to, and mainly it's very hard to investigate the Houthis if you are in their areas. They assign minders, to work with the journalists. It's very hard to move around and do reporting away from them that's independent enough so you can find the truth. But this is something we also want to work on, and yeah, there's no answer.
There's one just follow-up point that I think is probably helpful for all of us to keep in mind is that a lot of the information that's available, like in DC, to lawmakers and to the government, it's important, to keep in mind how much money the Gulf countries spend on lobbying and professorships and information. And not that the Iranians don't have their own, public outreach and propaganda arms, but in America, it's very quiet because of the sanctions. So a lot of us are hearing kind of one side, and I think that's part of the reason why the notion that Yemen is kind of an equal proxy war, rather than really a war of aggression of one country that's really pummeling another into the ground. Why that idea is able to kind of have such a long lifespan is because we really are getting a lot of our information and the color of this war from lobbyists on behalf of Gulf states.
Right, and you can see where, obviously, like the recent debate over the congressional resolution to be able to pull the U.S. out, it shows that there is beginning to be pushback and realization of kind of the one-sided nature of the conflict. And nevertheless, it's difficult to stop the support. So, all right, we'll go ahead and go to the next question, please.
Hi, my name is Leah Firestone. I'm a master's student here. My question is more about journalism in general. You mentioned that your photographer was taken out of Yemen because of his safety. I was wondering if the same considerations are then provided for people who are stringers. I understand that they provide you with a service, but how do you also, respect their safety and the risk they're taking by helping you report these stories?
We're limiting we're limiting our team into these three people: me, my Egyptian photographer and videographer, and that's all. Maybe in previous years we used to have other stringers and reporters from Yemen, and we never work on a controversial story or something that could cause troubles with them. We only do the safe stories with them. But since you are going to stay in the country, we're going to keep you away from this project. That's our deal with our reporters. I mean, we have people working for AP as news coverage, but for this kind of investigations, we don't deal with them at all. Even, I remember when I went to Sana'a, and our reporter is there, and he's based there, so I just stay away from us. Don't even talk to me. Don't even call me on the phone. And that was the deal. I mean, but when it comes to Mad, he's our videographer, and he gave his time for this kind of investigations. He was ready to leave. So that was very rare, like example of, case of the Yemeni work on kind of investigation and leave the country.
I just try generally just to be pretty deferential. There's going to be a lot of pressure to, go stay in the village for another hour or two past sundown, or to go back one more day, and I just try to keep in mind that this is someone who knows this area and this territory a lot better than I do, and so I just sort of try to defer and to defer to their knowledge, and generally they know a lot more about it than I do. I think that sometimes people get in trouble because the journalist says, no, like, we can go, it'll be fine. And then there's sort of an economic pressure because, you're the one who's paying them. So I haven't often run into that problem just because I don't think I'm very convincing. So when I go places and someone else says, no, we're not going there, I usually end up being, okay, fine. But I do try to keep that in mind, that I don't know this place, and this person does.
That's very good, very good.
Hi,
Yes.
I have two questions, separate questions. One, nobody talks about the quiet, the beautiful, the very peaceful Oman, sandwiched here, kind of, you've got Salalah, how far from the border, and you've got Saudi right up above. That's question one. How do they play into this now and possibly into the future? Because right now we know how things are, but when, we may get a new government at some time, The other question is, you have fixers. Do you always use the same string of fixers? Because if you do, aren't you worried that you're getting one side, one perspective, and you don't have the whole picture?
Yeah.
How do you go about making sure you have a balanced view, if you will?
Yeah. So two very different questions there. How about we start with, since it builds directly off of what you were just talking about, let's start with the fixer one. How do you work with that? And then we can take it up to the Oman question. So either one of you.
Yeah, I think the fixer local stringer is a big problem. I think Jeff was saying that the Gulf countries are spending a lot of money on lobbyists, and that gives a different misleading idea about the conflict. On the other hand, I think some Yemeni reporters who are allied with some of the militias and the forces on the ground, they give also misleading stories from the ground. And understanding the geography of this conflict gives an idea about whom you're dealing with. For example, if you have the school bus that was hit in Saada, if you remember this incident that killed dozens of children in a bus in the north part of the country. Saada is a military zone controlled by the Houthis. Knowing this, I know that any word that comes out of Saada will be controlled by Houthis and filtered by them. Whatever they say, I have question marks about it. Whatever a stringer gives me from that place, I have to go through different sources to check. So this is how I think is the ways to talk to many people and to check these reports from the stringers. Especially if I know that it's coming from a place that's totally under control of one of the sides of this conflict. However, we have a very long time reporter work for AP since 90s. We have built trust. He's very reliable. He's very balanced. He's from the south. He works in the north, so he has these connections. So this is someone we trust. He's kind of reference to us. I go to him all the time for advice and ask him, what do you think of this? And he would say, no, wait, don't publish now. We have to check this. So you need to have a kind of reference. At the same time, you need to understand the geography and where the word is coming from. And when it comes to this school bus, for example, it was very hard to really nail it down. Though everybody said it's the Saudis killed the children, I still myself I have doubts about what happened.
Jeff?
I didn't work with stringers.
Was it for a personal reason or just not having access? Or
Well, no, just I guess it was sort of a unique situation because I was working on a story about something that had happened a year and a half before, and I was looking for information that no one really cared about anymore. It was details about a strike that was no longer on anyone's consciousness. I mean, I think a similar thing applies with fixers. I mean, I think it's hard to live in a place at war and not have opinions. And more than someone who is overtly biased, I worry about someone who's a little bit biased and doesn't know it. But again, the best I think I can do is try to be conscientious of that and try to remember, try to think about why might this person be saying things in a certain way, what might be their kind of unconscious bias, and then anything that's actually factual and disprovable to corroborate it, which, you know, we have fact checkers that make sure that I've done that, and if I don't, I have to find a way of, you know, calling someone on the phone in the middle of a country under blockade. So the best I can do really is just constantly be questioning, even the person who, like, in whose hands my safety lies. I have to sort of interrogate what that person is telling me.
And then just continue, Jeff. We'll just continue with you and move back. The broader question about, you know, Oman, their role in this. And, you know, my understanding is they have been kind of in a unique position because unlike other members of the coalition, they've chosen, the other members of the GCC, they've chosen not to be involved in this conflict and maybe have attempted to play a stabilizing role. Is that consistent with your view of this, or any perspective that you have on their role in this conflict?
Yeah, the only role I know of is a very tangential one, and it's that it was in Oman that the Iranian nuclear deal, the negotiations of the Iranian nuclear deal began, which I think actually kind of is one of the original impetuses that got us arming the Saudis.
That's kind of one of the. There's been individuals like Ben Rhodes, who's part of this, who pushes back against that, but you can't remove this conflict and U.S. involvement from the Iranian nuclear deal and the need to be able to engage in diplomacy, and Oman being a key player in that. Maggie?
Oman played a really important role for the Houthis. It's the middleman between everyone who wants to talk to the Houthis. They go to the Omanis. The Omanis have very close relations to the British and the Iranians. And the dynamics here are not clear. I mean, except if you work really hard on understanding what kind of relations they have. But what we have seen is that Omanis are the one to go to if you need to talk to the Houthis. If Houthis want to fly out of Sana'a to go attend any meeting in Geneva or anything, they go through Oman. This is where they trust. During the talks in Kuwait that fell apart, that was in 2016, they also went through Oman and they were stuck there for like few months. I also know that Oman is a mediator when it comes to hostage taken by AQEP, Al-Qaeda militants. Every time there is a foreigner kidnapped by militants, the tribal leaders mediating for release of this hostage go through Oman. Why is this? It's just like a question. It's something I didn't work on, so I can't really tell, but they have been playing a role of mediator, an effective one all the time. Yeah.
Very good. All right, our next question.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm sorry. I appreciate the reporting that you've both done. I read that story about the well, and I'm glad you were speaking about the role of Raytheon. I think given that we're at the University of Chicago, it's also important to name General Dynamics, a weapons contractor that sells weapons to the Saudis, because their lead director is James Crown, who's on the board of trustees at this university, and his family is like Crown Fieldhouse, Crown House, et cetera. And I think given that's like one kind of example of the institutional role that the military-industrial complex has, given that institutional support for the war, which is unpopular in Congress, how can people apply pressure to end U.S. support for the war sort of after the veto? Thanks so much.
Great. Yeah, so kind of any insights you would have, and part of that could be, what's the power, maybe another way to kind of rephrase the question, what power can reporters have to try to influence, to say, well, despite this veto, what are other ways what are other things can be done to try to end U.S. support for this campaign? Jeff,
So I guess, there's one very big structural thing, which is that there are jobs that are directly part of or related to the defense industry in just about everybody's district.
Yeah.
One of the things I think that counters to that is that defense is actually not a very efficient way to put people to work. But it's a very effective cudgel with which to beat congressmen over the head. So I think there's a sort of a shifting of rhetoric that can happen there, that because there's a lot of congressmen who behind closed doors will say, look, I don't like it, but if I vote against this, I'll be out of office, next in a year, in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be true. I mean, there are other ways to have good jobs. I think we saw, perhaps mostly with Jamal Khashoggi, that if there's a story that is, that sort of sparks people's imagination enough, then that can also be a effective counter to all the lobbying dollars that that Gulf country can spend, that the defense industry can spend. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that it becomes sort of a contest between two stories. And there's one side that has a lot of money behind it, but if the other story is better, sometimes that can get, story gets free media. So I think that can be a counter. And I think that's why we've seen Congress slowly, or I guess, quickly, depending on your perspective, shift from the first times they tried to block sales. I think it was in early 2016 and got something like 20 votes, and slowly it's shifted to the point where we're actually passing it in both houses and it's taking a veto to stop it. So that is, it's a Pyrrhic victory, but it's perhaps a good sign.
The power to be able to shape the narrative, and
Yeah.
be able to change the narrative. Yeah. Maggie, did you have a view on this?
I think it's more reporting on the type of and the level of complicity or the involvement of U.S. in the war. One of the things we're trying to look into is to what extent the military advisors sitting in Riyadh are helping in all of this. What are other U.S. involvement in this war? This is what we need to continue to dig and find out. So we keep on going back to the same story about the U.S. involvement. Yeah.
No, but it is, both of your comments really do point to something that I know, talking to hearing from other individuals involved in policy, that a lot of it is about the narrative. And so that is where reporting and stories like the stories that both of you have put together can have an impact of kind of giving a narrative that points to, hence, shifting votes, right? And convincing people to shift votes. So our next question.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a student in the college. So your work has done a lot to communicate awareness to the international community, and you're seeking the most accurate information through stringers and the like. But I'm curious, what are the channels and networks of information between Yemeni people? How are they receiving information about the conflict? Because we saw with other conflicts in the Middle East, like the Arab Spring, there was a strong foundation in media, social media. So whether they're relying on radio or what is it? And also if you could speak to the areas of tension between the truth and propaganda for the Yemeni people.
Right. Either one of you wish to?
I think it's mainly WhatsApp.
Yeah.
WhatsApp is everything.
Yeah.
And that's a disaster because it's like, for example, sometimes they just translate our stories into Arabic. Translation is really bad. They take it out of context and then they spread it everywhere. And it turns into something else not related to what we did. So WhatsApp is a way of, it's good sometimes because, if you have an airstrike somewhere and you need to know what's happening, it's good to have something quick. But at the same time, the story, the news that comes out, they depend a lot on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter. But also they're very aware of the fact that the Houthis and also the Emiratis, who are in control of the north, of the south of the country, they also monitor, and they can. There's kind of surveillance, and so this is a source of concern for some people that they don't if you need to speak to someone, it's not going to be on WhatsApp. It's going to be Signal maybe and other secure way of communicating. Yeah.
The only thing I'd add is that there are TV channels. There's the pro-Houthi TV channel and pro-Saudi TV channels, and I think it's pretty transparent. Everybody knows what their point of view is, but they're there. Some people watch.
There's the equivalent of the CNN and the Fox News.
Yeah.
in Yemen.
Much worse.
Yes. So, well, that was our last question. And before we wrap up, the first thing I want to do is thank the institutes here on campus and more broadly that have helped to put on this event. The Institute of Politics, the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts, and of course the Pulitzer Center, which really played a key role in helping to bring both of you here to campus. With that, I really want to also thank all of you for coming out tonight. I think this is an important event. Hopefully we all, I know myself, come away more informed from having been here tonight. And then finally, just thank both of you for coming to speak with me.